afternoon. I'm Nancy Wright, and I'm very pleased to moderate this superb panel that is coming up. And the panelists all will be keeping their remarks to 15 minutes. We all deeply feel that you each have so much to contribute. We want to leave an hour for response from the audience. And so I would like to seed your thinking as you hear our panelists with the questions, two of the questions that have been given to them, because we would like to hear your response to those questions. Sure, you can ask questions of them in the Q&A time, but we also would love to hear your response to these two questions. In order to be truly faithful, what messages should we share and what actions will we take on climate disruption? And second, how do you integrate these actions and messages with your inner spiritual and religious life? The first speaker is Sister Patricia Siemen. She's a Dominican sister from Michigan, and she's also an attorney. She currently serves as the director of the Center for Earth Jurisprudence in Barry University School of Law. And she's previously held positions as the director of the Earth Ethics Institute at Miami-Dade College, staff attorney for the voting section of the United States Department of Justice, the Civil Rights Division, and legal services attorney for migrant farm workers in South Florida. Sister Pat, as you can imagine, has also served in community organizing with the African American community, in parish ministry with the Latino community, and in elementary education. May I introduce to you Sister Pat Siemen.
Thank you. I have my timer as well. So, we've had full 2 days. And what I want to share with you today is just in the beginning a bit of my own journey. From what Nancy said, it's probably obvious that my commitment to addressing climate justice and concern for the quality of the natural world, its health, vitality, has really come out of my commitment from my faith perspective for care for people and has expanded to care for Earth. So it is a continuum. And as a younger woman, I was highly moved and committed to seeing the need for social justice on every single level. I continue that commitment, but the lens has widened. So what I want to say is that holding on to my tradition as a Dominican sister in the Roman Catholic tradition, I want to tell you that St. Dominic, who founded the Dominican priests and sisters, dates back to 1206. And the issue in southern France at that time was that matter was perceived as evil, that it did not have its own integrity. And so the goodness of creation is actually one of the foundational principles of being Dominican, along with our contemporaries and much better known for care for Earth, our Franciscan brothers and sisters. So, facing today that climate disruption, and I would say the destruction of the entire Earth community, is our greatest moral challenge for our era. And this image here about con qué derecho, with what right, was actually the refrain that the Dominican friars used as Hispaniola, now known as Cuba and the Dominican Republic, was being decimated by the Spaniards who invaded and colonialized, but not only that, of course, completely exterminated the native peoples. The Dominican friars who went there were from Spain. They gathered and did the critique that this decimation of the indigenous peoples and their land was wrong. And they had great courage. They preached this publicly. But the unique piece about this is that they met as a community. They framed the preaching as a community and then selected one of them to deliver the message. When the Spanish, basically military, came knocking on their door after a Sunday sermon and wanted to arrest the friar who delivered the message, Antonios Montesinos, the entire community came forward and they said, "We did the preaching." This, I think, is a seed of a model as we go forward. You don't go alone. Now, I just superimposed here the image of earth because I can't say I was raised steeped in this understanding, but certainly John's message in the Gospel of John, Jesus' prayer that all may be one, in my world clearly can be interpreted that all that exists may be one. And also, recently I heard someone speak about from Matthew, where Jesus was outraged and threw people out of the temple for buying and selling and basically commodifying a sacred space. Jesus said, "You have made my house of prayer a den of thieves." That also, I think, can be applied to what's happening to earth. You have made my house, which is supposed to be one of reverence and inclusion, a den of thieves. So I come out of the Roman Catholic tradition, and I said to Bruce, it's a good thing I didn't answer that question about the role of women that you asked earlier. Coming out of a very patriarchal tradition. However, one does what one can with one tradition, and I will say I stay in my tradition as a Roman Catholic primarily because of the group of women I belong to. The faith community sustains me. And secondly, I will just say this, in my understanding of church, it belongs to all of us, and therefore our voices need to stay in it. At least for some of us. I understand those of us that can't tolerate it, but we need to stay in it and have our voice be heard. So that's why I'm there. But so we do have within the Roman Catholic tradition at least teachings, primarily in the Roman Catholic tradition, it's Catholic social teaching. But on climate change, the U.S. Catholic bishops back in 2005 made this statement. It's interesting because they say the global climate change debate, well, it's no longer a debate, but in 2005, that was some of the language we were using, cannot become just another opportunity for some groups, usually affluent advocates from the developed nations, to blame the problem on population growth in poor countries. Now, I know our church gets a little fetish about population control. However, I do think it's the dignity of the human, but I think the more important piece is that those of us in wealthy nations and wealthy peoples often point the finger at those people, and usually it's the other who does, and we fail to look at our own consumptive patterns and what we're doing. So historically, the industrialized countries have emitted more greenhouse gases. And we know all of this, but to have the Catholic bishops say this, it's part of their core teachings on climate change. And I really highlighted here, affluent nations such as our own, because they're speaking from the US, have to acknowledge the impact of voracious consumerism instead of simply calling for population and emissions control from people in poor nations. So that's consistent with a lot of what we've heard. Furthermore, core principles of Catholic social teaching for climate change really rest on three values: prudence, which is our own interior self-restraint, and also the value of participation of the wider community. Those who are affected by a policy ought to be engaged in the decision-making. And one thing I think the Catholic Church has consistently stood for, particularly in many of what we designate as developing countries, and that truly is solidarity with the most vulnerable. We know we have wealthy clergy and wealthy churches also, but traditionally, the Catholics have often put their bodies on the line and really have stood in solidarity. And then always that core important value of the common good. And so it's that interdependence and moral responsibility to care for each other and to protect creation. If we could build public policy, I'd take even one of those values. We would get a lot further, I think, in climate justice and social justice. However, I do think, as we know, and with all of the energies of so many people of goodwill, that there is a spiritual and cultural shift happening. It's what we're naming here. We're naming here the role that faith can actually play in bringing about a different way of being. And this is an incredible quote. I don't usually quote popes. This is being recorded, isn't it? Got my back, okay. But Pope Benedict said in a talk in 2009, listen to this, we cannot simply do whatever we want with this earth of ours. Now, it's a little anthropocentric, but that's part of our tradition. We cannot simply do whatever we want with the earth of ours. We must respect the interior laws of creation of the earth. This obedience to the voice of earth is more important for our future happiness than the desires of the moment. Earth is talking to us. Did we hear that this morning? We are voices of earth. Earth is talking to us, and we must listen to her and decipher her message if we want to survive. Okay, so one of our questions to be deliberated on is, what does being faithful mean in the midst of climate disruption? So some of the things I think we have to recognize in order to be faithful, you've heard all this before, but is to acknowledge our interdependence and our oneness. People of our Buddhist tradition teach us that over and over, and as we know, science does too now. We are all interdependent. Also, that we each have to claim our own individual and communal complicity in climate disruption. We know we don't just point the finger at others. Even if we're driving a Prius, our whole economy is based on fossil fuel. A bigger piece for the inner transformation and the communal transformation is our taking the time to grieve what is lost, what is being lost, and to literally touch that grief ourselves. I do not think we can have effective climate policy changes that are required without a deep inner journey and touching the grief of what we are doing. I was fortunate to go to Bolivia in 2010 and attend the People's Convention on the Rights of Mother Earth, and out of that, and then that came out because of the failure of the Copenhagen Climate Change Conference, and it was amazing. They were preparing Bolivia after Copenhagen failed in 2009. Then Bolivia said, if the world leaders can't do it, then we will call it People's Conference, and we will gather the people to come and speak about climate and what needs to happen. And they thought maybe about 15,000 people would gather. Now, granted, they had between January and they called it for April, so they had a few months to get this together. 35,000 of us gathered. So out of that, I learned about their practice of vivir bien, how to live well. Okay. 3 minutes left? Wow. I guess I didn't push my clock. Okay, so being faithful is different than being successful. Another important thing that we have to do is to integrate our response with our inner spiritual life. And I think one of the things I want to say here is one of Thomas Berry's, who has had deep influence on my own development and the development of the Center for Earth Jurisprudence, but it is an awakening to the psychic, spiritual dimension of the universe. so that if we indeed experience a sense of religious calling or spirituality or connection to the sacred, it is already embodied in the universe and in the earth. We are an evolutionary species. If we have it within us, it's already been in the larger arena. I think that we have to be about sacred activism. That's language that Andrew Harvey uses. It calls for a different type of activism. We need to know why and in what we are grounded. And I do think that part of the future, and I hope this doesn't go only to despair, but I think it goes to part of the reality. Some of us really need to consider that we will be hospice workers in different settings. We have unleashed so much damage already, and to develop capacities to be healers. We need to change our lens from a very traditional, dominant, basically male on the top figure to one that's much more integrative. And to me, I just want to say about the circular piece, it doesn't mean that we're, in my perspective, now other traditions may have other beliefs, but to me it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that the fish and the snakes and the birds and the humans are all equal. We're differentiated. So we may not be equal, but we all have equal value. We have different callings. Is that, okay, let me just go to the end. I want to do this to just honor Teilhard de Chardin, because I think what is needed and what we've been gathering here is fire in our soul. And it is the fire of the global community. So when he said, someday, after mastering the winds, the waves, the tides, and gravity, we shall harness for God the energies of love, and then, for a second time in the history of the world, humans will have discovered fire. Thank you.